In the merciless summer of '78, when the sun bleached the very memory of color from the landscape, Verer worked in the shade of his lean-to, the rhythmic thump of his cleaver a steady heartbeat against the oppressive silence. Before him lay the fresh carcass of a young buck, its life surrendered only hours before. All around his small homestead, the air vibrated with heat, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Yet, when he lifted the heavy, insulated door of the strange structure half buried in the hillside behind his cabin, a plume of cool, subterranean air washed over his face, carrying the scent of damp earth and stone. Inside the dark chamber, the temperature was a different season. He laid the carefully butchered haunches on a slatted wooden shelf, the deep red of the meat a stark jewel in the gloom, and felt the chill of the place settle into his bones, a profound and satisfying cold in a world that was burning. Not a mile away, his neighbor, Jedediah, cursed the same sun, swatting at a black cloud of flies that swarmed the deer he was desperately trying to salt down, the meat already turning soft and tacky in the suffocating heat. He worked with a frantic energy, knowing it was a losing race, another offering to the god of spoilage that ruled these lands in the high summer. The great paradox of the valley that year was Verer's cool box, a quiet miracle of earth and air that held the line against decay while the rest of the world rotted. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of quiet ingenuity and forgotten history resonate with you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The obsession that drove Verer to dig his hole in the ground had not been born of genius, but of desperation. It began 2 years prior, during the cruelest of seasons, the false spring. That winter had been good for the hunt. The snows came early and deep, driving the game down from the high country. Verer had worked tirelessly, his rifle speaking with a deadly economy. He had filled their larder, and more importantly, he had packed the small stone springhouse down by the creek with a king's ransom of venison and elk, layering the precious meat with thick blocks of ice sawn from the frozen creek and packed snow that insulated it all in a tomb of perfect cold. He and his wife Agnes had looked upon their work with the deep satisfaction of people who had cheated the coming scarcity. They had a fortress against the hunger of late winter, but the land was a fickle warden. In late February, a warm wind, a chinook, had slithered down from the mountains. It was a treacherous breeze, smelling of damp earth and a spring that had no right to be there. For a week, the temperature soared. The deep snowpack, the work of months, vanished in a torrent of meltwater. The creek, normally a placid ribbon of silver, became a brown, roaring beast. It swelled over its banks, and Verer watched with a growing knot of dread as the water crept up the stones of his springhouse. The structure, a bastion of cold, became a trap. The meltwater, far from being icy, was tepid. It seeped through the stone walls, melting the last of the ice, and submerged the carefully stored meat. When the flood receded and a proper cold snap returned, the damage was done. Verer had opened the heavy wooden door to a scene of absolute ruin. The water that remained was a foul, stagnant soup. The meat, their entire winter security, was a swollen gray mass, adrift in its own decay. The smell that billowed out was the smell of starvation. The failure was total. The conventional wisdom, the method passed down for generations, had betrayed them. The springhouse was meant to use the cold of the earth and water, but it was entirely dependent on the weather remaining cold. It had no power of its own. It was a passive system, and when the conditions it relied upon vanished, it not only failed, but accelerated the disaster. The water, which should have been a preservative, became a vector for rot. It was a systemic flaw, a catastrophic vulnerability that everyone simply accepted as a risk of frontier life. Bad luck, they would call it, an act of God. But as Verer stood there, the stench of his failure clinging to his clothes, he felt a different understanding take root. It was not bad luck. It was a bad design. It was a failure of imagination to believe this was the only way. The grief for the lost food, for the hard months of hunger that he and Agnes now faced, hardened into a cold, clear resolve. He would not be a victim of the seasons. He would build something better. That spring and summer were lean. They survived on small game, foraged roots, and the grim charity of neighbors who had been luckier. But while Vera's body was occupied with the hunt for their next meal, his mind was elsewhere. He became a man consumed by a single problem: how to create cold when there was none. The obsession was a quiet fire that burned away all other trivial concerns. He no longer joined the men at the trading post for talk of trapping yields or politics. He walked his own land and the lands around it not as a hunter, but as a student of temperature. He carried a small spade with him, and he would stop to dig. He dug in the deep shade of the north-facing slopes, in the sun-baked meadows, in the damp soil by the creek. He would plunge his hand into the earth, feeling for the line where the sun's heat gave way to the deep, abiding coolness of the planet. He learned the language of thermal mass, the simple truth that the Earth itself was a vast reservoir of stability. His research became a journey. He rode for 2 days to a settlement where a German stonemason was building a great house for a wealthy land speculator. The man, an old artisan named Gustav, was their catalyst. Vera did not ask about building walls, he asked about cellars. Gustav, intrigued by the strange, intense man, led him down into the half-finished basement. Even with the summer air heavy above them, the stone-lined cavern was remarkably cool. "The earth is a blanket," Gustav had said, his accent thick. "In winter, it keeps the frost out. In summer, it keeps the heat out. The deeper you go, the more honest the temperature." He explained the importance of stone, not just for strength, but for its ability to absorb and hold the cold of the night long into the day. Vera listened, absorbing every word, his mind already sketching designs in the dirt floor of the cellar. He continued his pilgrimage of knowledge. He observed how potters in the next valley kept their clay sheds cool and damp, using porous earthenware jars filled with water, which sweated and cooled the air around them. He saw the principle of evaporative cooling in its rawest form. He spent a day watching the construction of a new mine shaft, noting how the miners engineered a system of vents to draw fresh air down and pull stale, warm air out. They spoke of drafts and convection, of how a tall, sun-heated vent stack could create a powerful, predictable draw. He visited other homesteads, not for company, but for reconnaissance. He saw their spring houses, their root cellars, their smoke houses. He saw the same flaws everywhere. Structures that were passive, vulnerable, and utterly dependent on the cooperation of the weather. He saw the cracks where heat seeped in, the poor drainage that invited rot, the single doors that broke the seal of cold every time they were opened. The key insight did not arrive in a single flash of lightning, but coalesced slowly from these disparate observations. It was not one principle, but 3, working in harmony. First, Gustav's earth blanket. He had to go deep, deeper than a root cellar, to escape the influence of the surface heat and tap into the Earth's constant temperature. Second, the potter's jar. He needed to introduce water into his system, not as a flood, but as a controlled dampness that would actively cool the air through evaporation. Third, the miner's shaft. He had to manage the air itself, creating a deliberate and constant flow, a slow, cold breath. Hot air had to be vented out from the top, which would in turn pull cooler, ground-level air in from a separate intake. He would build a machine that breathed. He returned to his homestead a changed man. The vague obsession had crystallized into a concrete plan. He rode to the main trading post, a full day's journey, with a list that baffled the clerk. He didn't buy traps or ammunition or salt. He bought a coil of metal stovepipe, several large sacks of coarse burlap, and a bag of charcoal, the kind used by blacksmiths. He also purchased a heavy-duty winch and pulley system. He bartered a prime beaver pelt for a finely made thermometer, a delicate instrument of glass and mercury that was a rare and expensive luxury. The other men at the post watched him load his strange cargo. Jedediah was there and clapped him on the shoulder. "Starting a blacksmith shop, Vera? Or maybe you're building a new kind of chimney that goes into the ground." The laughter that followed Vera out the door did not touch him. He had the pieces of his puzzle. Now he had to assemble them. The work began the next day. He chose a spot on the gentle slope behind his cabin, a place that caught the morning sun but was shaded by a stand of old oaks in the afternoon. He marked out a rectangle in the dirt, 10 feet long and 6 feet wide. Then he began to dig. The labor was brutal, a solitary battle with the earth. The topsoil gave way to a dense layer of clay and then to stone-riddled hardpan. He used a pickaxe to break the ground, his shoulders screaming with the effort, and shoveled the loosened dirt into a bucket. Agnes, his silent ally, worked the winch, hauling bucket after bucket to the surface, her quiet presence a steady source of strength. She did not ask questions or offer doubts. She saw the fire in her husband's eyes and knew that this was not a whim. It was a reckoning. Days turned into weeks. The pit grew deeper, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet. He was no longer digging a cellar, he was excavating a tomb. The mockery from the community began in earnest. Jedediah and others would ride by, slowing their horses to peer down into the ever-deepening hole. "Digging for gold, Vera?" one would shout. "Careful you don't dig straight through to China," another would jest. Jedediah, ever the leader of the chorus, gave the project its name. "Look at him down there," he said one afternoon, leaning on the growing pile of excavated earth. "Sweating in a hole just to make a place to cool off. It's Verer's Folly." The name stuck. It became a local landmark, a shorthand for eccentric obsession. Verer ignored them. He was a man possessed by the logic of his design. When the pit reached a depth of 10 feet, he stopped digging down and began building up. The construction was as meticulous and demanding as the excavation. He had spent weeks hauling fieldstone from the creek bed, and now he began to line the pit, dry stacking the stones with a mason's precision. This was not a crude retaining wall. It was a carefully engineered membrane. He left small, deliberate gaps between the stones, creating a porous outer shell. This was the first secret of the design. The space between the stone wall and the earthen bank of the pit he packed with a thick layer of blacksmith's charcoal. The charcoal would act as both an insulator and a desiccant, pulling moisture from the surrounding earth but preventing it from becoming sodden. Inside the stone lining, he constructed a second, smaller chamber from thick planks of oak. This was the sanctum, the box itself. He left a 6-inch gap between the inner wooden wall and the outer stone wall. This interstitial space was the engine of his machine. He filled it with a mixture of sand and sphagnum moss, a medium that would hold water like a sponge. From the top, he ran a small, perforated copper pipe, fed by a rain barrel he placed uphill from the entrance. A simple valve allowed him to control a slow, steady drip of water that would keep the sand and moss mixture perpetually damp but never flooded. Next, he installed the lungs of the system. On the downslope side of the pit, he dug a shallow trench and laid a length of 6-inch stovepipe, his intake vent. Its mouth was low to the ground, nestled in a patch of shady ferns where the air was always cooler and heavier. The pipe entered the box at floor level. For the exhaust, he ran another pipe from the ceiling of the inner chamber up through the roof of the structure and extended it 10 feet into the air. This pipe, the chimney, he painted with a mixture of soot and pine tar, turning it dead black. This was the hidden genius at work. The black pipe would absorb the heat of the sun, warming the column of air inside it. This warm air would rise, creating a vacuum that would pull the warm, moist air from the top of the chamber out. This, in turn, would draw a fresh supply of cool, dense air in through the low intake pipe, forcing it to pass through the damp, cold sand wall, chilling it further. He had built a passive, self-regulating convection engine. Finally, he built the entrance. He framed a small anteroom, a sort of airlock, with 2 heavy insulated doors. The outer door was thick oak. The inner door was even thicker, packed with sawdust and lined with rabbit fur for a perfect seal. One could not open both doors at once, preventing the precious cold from spilling out. The whole structure was then buried. He covered the roof with a thick layer of sod so that from a distance it looked like a natural swell in the earth, with only the strange black chimney and the low wooden entrance to betray its existence. He had not built on the land, he had built into the land, making a partner of its immense stabilizing power. He finished his work in late May, just as the days were beginning to lengthen and carry the first real hints of summer's ferocity. The air was warm, the ground was dry, and the season of risk was upon them. The timing was perfect. His folly was complete, a silent, half-buried monument to 2 years of toil and ridicule. It was time for the first test. The community saw the completion of the project not as a triumph, but as the end of a peculiar form of entertainment. The hole was filled, the man was done with his madness, and life would go on. They were certain his underground box would be a damp, moldy failure within a month. The test was simple. Agnes had milked their lone cow that morning, and the pail of milk was still warm. The air temperature was already climbing into the 80s. Normally, that milk would have to be churned into butter or made into cheese within hours, lest it sour. Verer took the pail, along with a small joint of salted pork, and placed them inside the inner chamber of the cooling box. He closed the inner door, its fur lining whispering against the jamb, then the heavy outer door, which seated with a solid thud. He left it for a full day, resisting the urge to check on it. He went about his chores, acutely aware of the silent process taking place within the earth behind him. The next afternoon, with the sun at its peak, he opened the doors. The air that greeted him was a revelation. It was not just cool, it was cold, with the clean, damp smell of a cave. He reached for the pail. The metal was shockingly chilled to the touch. He dipped a finger into the milk. It was as cold and sweet as if it had been pulled from a winter creek. A thick layer of cream had risen to the top. The salted pork was firm and dry. He retrieved his precious thermometer. He left it inside for 10 minutes, then pulled it out. The mercury read a steady 45 degrees, while the air outside shimmered at 88. It was more than a success. It was a miracle. The system worked. The slow, cold breath he had engineered was real. The proof of concept was absolute, at least to him. But his neighbors remained unconvinced. They saw him bringing fresh milk from the structure and storing cuts of meat for days at a time. They acknowledged that it seemed to work, but their skepticism found new footing. "It's a waste of good lumber," one said. "And all that digging for what? To save a bit of milk from turning?" Jedediah was particularly dismissive. "It's a novelty," he declared at the trading post. "It might work on a warm day in June, but it relies on the deep cool of the spring soil. Wait until August. Wait until the ground itself is baked dry and the sun beats down for a month straight. Then we'll see how his folly fares. It will be an oven." They saw it not as an engineered system, but as a temporary fluke, a foolish extravagance that would inevitably fail when truly tested. For them, a certain amount of spoilage was a fact of life, and Vera's attempt to defy it seemed like an arrogant challenge to the natural order. They would wait. The real heat was coming. And then it came. The summer of '78 arrived not as a season, but as an affliction. It began in July with a week of dry, searing heat that crisped the edges of the broadleaf trees and lowered the level of the creek. But that was only a prelude. In August, a great stagnant dome of heat settled over the entire territory. For 3 weeks, the sky was a harsh, cloudless sheet of white. The sun was not a friendly star, but a malevolent eye. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, then 105, and on the worst days, it touched 110. The air was thin and hard to draw. The nights brought no relief, only a suffocating, windless dark where the heat radiating from the baked earth was a palpable presence. It was a legendary heat, the kind old men would speak of for generations to come. It was the test Jedediah had wished for. The heat wave was a slow-motion disaster. For the first week, people managed. They worked in the pre-dawn hours and spent the afternoons in the shade, listless and drenched in sweat. But the unrelenting heat began to attack their most critical resource, their stored food. The traditional methods of preservation failed, one by one, with catastrophic speed. The spring houses, which should have been refuges of cool, became lukewarm baths as the springs themselves ran warm. Meat stored within them turned in a matter of days. The smokehouses were useless. The ambient heat was so high that meat would begin to spoil before the smoke could cure it, attracting swarms of flies that laid their eggs in the tainted flesh. Barrels of salted pork and beef, stored in sheds and pantries, began to go rancid, the heat accelerating the oxidization of the fat, filling the air with a foul, sharp smell. Panic began to curdle the spirit of the community. A successful hunt, normally a cause for celebration, became a source of anxiety. There was no way to preserve the bounty. Families were forced to gorge themselves on fresh meat for a day or two, and then watch, helpless, as the rest rotted. The specter of a hungry winter, once a distant threat, was now a certainty. The land was providing, but they had lost the ability to store its gifts. Jedediah was hit the hardest. He was a proud and successful hunter, and just before the heat wave had crested, he had brought down 2 large elk, enough meat to see his family through the entire winter. He and his wife had worked frantically to jerk and salt the meat, but the heat was too powerful. The strips of drying meat turned black and brittle. The salted cuts in his cellar began to ooze a putrid liquid. Within 2 weeks, his entire winter's supply, the product of immense effort and skill, was a heap of stinking refuse that he had to bury in a deep pit to keep the wolves away. The loss broke something in him. His confidence evaporated, replaced by a quiet, simmering desperation. Amidst this widespread decay, Vera's homestead was an island of stability. The relentless sun beat down on the sod roof of his cooling box, but inside, the system held its ground. The black chimney grew hot, its draw increasing, pulling air through the damp subterranean chamber with greater vigor. The hotter the day, the harder the system worked. Vera monitored it daily. The temperature inside never rose above 50 degrees. His stores of meat, jerky, and dairy remained perfectly preserved, cool and fresh in their dark, silent tomb. He had butchered the buck at the start of the heat wave, and weeks later, the meat was as good as the day he had killed it. His folly had become an arc. The rescue, when it came, was a quiet affair, stripped of all pride. Jedediah appeared at Vera's cabin one evening, just as the sun was setting, painting the scorched sky in bruised colors of orange and purple. He did not look like the confident, boastful man who had mocked Vera for months. He was diminished, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with worry. His youngest child was sick with a summer fever, and his wife was worn thin with work and anxiety. They had little left to eat but cornmeal and dried beans. He stood before Vera, twisting his hat in his hands, unable to meet his neighbor's eyes. "Vera," he began, his voice raspy. We have nothing. The elk." It all turned. He didn't need to say more. The story was the same at every homestead. He was not asking for a handout, he was admitting defeat. He was asking for help from the man whose strange obsession he had ridiculed without mercy. Vera simply nodded. He felt no triumph, no desire to gloat. He saw only a neighbor in need, a father with a hungry family. He lit a lantern, led Jedediah to the cooling box, and opened the heavy doors. The wave of cold air that washed over them in the sweltering twilight was like a physical blow. Jedediah stared into the chamber, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the neatly stored meat, the pails of milk, the wheels of cheese, all resting in a state of perfect, impossible preservation. It was a treasure chamber. Vera took his knife, carved off a generous haunch of venison and a large slab of cured bacon, and wrapped them in a clean cloth. He handed the bundle to Jedediah. "Take this," he said. "There is more if you need it." Jedediah took the meat, his hands trembling slightly. "I was a fool, Vera," he whispered. "A blind fool." Vera just shook his head. "We all were," he said. "We were just doing what we were taught." The act of charity broke the dam of pride in the community. The next day, 2 more families came to Vera, their stories the same as Jedediah's. Vera gave to them freely, sharing the bounty his foresight had preserved. His quiet, sturdy box, once the subject of so much derision, had become the community's larder, the single point of success in a season of universal failure. The vindication was absolute and undeniable. It wasn't just that Vera's method had worked, it was that every other method had failed. The contrast was stark and irrefutable, written in the health of his family and the hunger of theirs. Vera's folly had saved them from the consequences of their own rigid adherence to tradition. The heat wave had burned away their skepticism, leaving only a grudging, desperate respect. When the heat finally broke in September, ushered out by a line of thunderstorms that washed the dust from the air and replenished the creeks, a new kind of delegation arrived at Vera's door. It was Jedediah, along with 3 other senior men from the settlement. They were not there for more meat. They came with shovels and pickaxes in their hands and humility in their hearts. "Vera," Jedediah said, speaking for all of them, "we need you to teach us how to build one." It was the ultimate concession, a complete reversal. They were not just admitting he was right, they were asking to copy his madness. Vera agreed without hesitation. He sought no payment, no special status, no credit for his invention. His reward was the memory of that foul-smelling spring house and the gnawing hunger that had followed. He wanted to ensure no one else would have to endure that. For the rest of that autumn, Vera became the settlement's busiest man. He went from homestead to homestead, a traveling consultant of cold. He surveyed their land, helping them choose the best spot. He explained the principles of his design, the 3 crucial elements of depth, evaporation, and airflow. He supervised the digging, corrected their mistakes, and showed them the fine details that made the difference between a damp hole and a functioning cooling engine. By the first snow of that winter, a half-dozen new cooling boxes dotted the settlement. They were not all identical to his. Some men used clay pipe instead of metal. Others used different insulating materials based on what they had. But they all followed the same core principles. The local adoption was swift and total. The traditional spring house, once a staple of every homestead, was now seen as an obsolete liability. Vera's design became the new standard, the new conventional wisdom. It was a quiet, practical revolution, born from a single man's refusal to accept failure. The idea did not remain confined to their small valley. The following summer, a traveling builder, a man who made his living constructing cabins and barns for new settlers moving west, passed through. He stayed with Jedediah's family for a week and was astonished by the cooling box, which kept butter firm and meat fresh through the mild heat of July. He had never seen anything like it. He spent 2 days with Vera, sketching the design in a worn, leather-bound notebook, filling pages with measurements and notes on the theory of its operation. This man, the disseminator, was a vector for the idea. As he traveled into new territories, he began incorporating the design into the homesteads he built. He did not call it Vera's box. He called it the mountain cooler, or the deep earth larder. He sold it as a feature, a mark of a well-built homestead. The idea spread through him and through others who saw it and copied it. Settlers wrote letters home describing the ingenious cellar that could make ice in the summer. A few years later, a version of the design, simplified and standardized, appeared in a popular settler's guide, with no mention of its origin, presented simply as a wise and proven method for food preservation on the frontier. The innovation had become anonymous, a piece of folk knowledge, its roots in a single man's tragic loss and obsessive labor completely severed. Decades passed. Vera and Agnes lived out their lives on their homestead. The settlement grew into a small town. The cooling boxes Vera had helped build were eventually replaced by root cellars, then ice boxes fed by commercial ice houses, and finally by electric refrigerators. His innovation, so critical for a generation, became a relic. Vera grew old, a quiet man known for his skill as a farmer and his reserved nature. The younger generation knew him only as a pioneer, one of the first to settle the valley. The story of the heat wave of '78 and the folly that saved everyone was a fading legend, a tale for grandfathers to tell. He died on a crisp autumn morning, the kind he had always loved. His passing was as quiet as his life. The town buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the valley. The simple stone marker, paid for by the town council, was carved with a few spare words that they felt summarized his life. It read, "Vera, husband, farmer, a good neighbor." There was no mention of his true legacy, no epitaph for the inventor who had secured the future of the very town that now memorialized him with such plain sentiment. His greatest contribution was already forgotten, absorbed into the common sense of the past. The enduring impact of his work was unmeasurable, but it was real. For 50 years, across 1,000 miles of frontier, variations of his cooling box preserved food, prevented sickness, and buffered countless families from the brutal whims of nature. The number of lives touched, the instances of hunger averted, were lost to history, an invisible legacy woven into the fabric of survival. His idea became a silent, anonymous guardian for a generation of settlers pushing into the unforgiving lands of the West. Years later, a historian tracing old property lines stumbled upon the collapsed remains of Vera's original homestead. The cabin was little more than a pile of rotten logs, but the gentle swell of the earth behind it was still there. Curious, the historian began to clear away the brush and dirt, uncovering the stone lintel of a doorway leading into the ground. He found the remains of the two heavy doors and the strange rusted stovepipe sticking out of the ground like a broken periscope. He peered into the darkness, a cool, earthy breath rising to meet him. He recognized it as some kind of advanced root cellar, but the dual vent system and the evidence of a water wicking mechanism were unlike anything he had ever seen documented. He took photographs and made notes, cataloging it as a peculiar anomaly, a puzzle of frontier engineering. He stood there for a long time, wondering about the forgotten builder who, for reasons unknown, had gone to such extraordinary lengths, never realizing he was standing at the source of a revolution, a quiet monument to a man who, when faced with a problem, had simply dug a better answer out of the earth itself.